As human beings, we all want to believe we'd help someone in need, whether it's giving a meal, a blanket, or even just listening to their troubles. But what happens when that trust is betrayed? What happens when the very person you turn to for safety and care becomes the one who leads you and your child to death? Behind the walls of one maternity home, Kotobuki-san'in, hope turned into horror. Babies left in their care didn't find safety. They starved, they froze, they were smothered. And by the time the truth came out, more than 100 innocent children had become victims. This is the story of Miyuki Ishikawa, Japan's demon midwife, and one of the most shocking cases of child killings in history. Japan, right after World War II, was a nation in chaos. The US occupation had turned the country upside down. Traditional ways of life were crumbling, while Western influences, clothing, movies, even speech, started to flood in. Cities once lit by lanterns were now glowing with electric lamps. For those living in the middle or upper classes, these changes felt like a breath of fresh air, a chance to start over after years of devastating war. But for the poor, nothing really changed. Poverty never left them. The new modern lifestyle just meant more things they could never afford, more rules to adapt to, more paths to struggle through. Every day became about survival. Food was scarce, medicine was harder to get, and in that world, more children didn't mean joy. It meant more mouths to feed, more despair. And then came a woman who promised hope, a woman who held out her hand to the desperate, offering them a way out. Her name was Miyuki Ishikawa. She claimed she could give children born into poverty a better chance, a brighter life. To do this, she ran what she called a maternity home, a place meant for poor mothers, abandoned children, and unwanted babies of wartime Japan. To those who had nothing, Miyuki looked like a savior. Families came to her doors, trusting her with the most precious gift, their children. But what they didn't know was that their decision would become a lifelong regret, because behind that promise of care lay something much darker. But before we step into the horrors of what happened, let's take a look at Miyuki's life. She wasn't always known as Ishikawa. She was born Miyuki Komaru on February 5, 1897, in Honjo, Miyazaki Prefecture. At the time, education in Japan was limited, especially for women. But Miyuki wasn't like most girls of her era. She managed to graduate from the Miyazaki Prefectural Vocational School, a highly respected institution. Then, at just 18 years old, she moved to Tokyo, enrolling in the Department of Midwifery Training at the Tokyo Imperial University School of Medicine. For a woman in early 1900s Japan, this was rare, and Miyuki excelled. On September 30th, 1919, she graduated with high marks and officially registered as a midwife with the Tokyo Prefecture under registration number 5769. That same year, she married Takeshi Ishikawa, a man 3 years her senior. Takeshi had once studied agriculture but left school to become a military police sergeant. Later, he served as an officer in the Metropolitan Police Department until 1926. Together, Miyuki and Takeshi raised a family. They had one son from Takeshi's previous marriage, and later adopted 3 more children, 2 boys and a girl. On the surface, it looked like the perfect household, a well-educated, ambitious woman, a husband with a career in law enforcement, a respectable family. The two lived happily with their little family, or at least, that's how it appeared from the outside. Miyuki poured her life into running the maternity home, Kotobuki-san'in. For over 30 years, she presented it as a place of hope, offering help to pregnant women, to mothers who couldn't afford medical care, and to children who had no one else. When Takeshi retired from his police work, he didn't take on a regular job. Instead, he worked alongside Miyuki, handling the paperwork and procedures for foster children. Part of Miyuki's devotion to children came from a deeply personal place. She had undergone a hysterectomy. Her uterus and ovaries were removed. That meant she could never bear her own biological children. So, in a way, taking in the unwanted and the abandoned became her substitute for motherhood. And she and Takeshi even adopted 3 kids themselves. Her career soared. To many, Miyuki was more than just a midwife. She was a savior. She climbed the ranks until she was holding powerful positions. Director of the Japan Midwife Nurse Public Health Association, director of the Tokyo Metropolitan Midwifery Association's Ushigome branch, even president of the Ushigome Midwifery Association. In the eyes of society, she wasn't just respected, she was untouchable. At one point, she even ran for political office in Shinjuku. She lost, but the fact that she was a candidate showed just how influential she had become. But here's the thing. Behind that reputation, Kotobuki-san'in wasn't really just a maternity home. It was a place where the darkest struggles of post-war Japan played out. At a time when food, medicine, and money were scarce, having a child wasn't a blessing. It was a burden many families simply couldn't carry. Labor was expensive. Raising a child was almost impossible. And with crime rising, especially sexual assaults, the numbers of unwanted pregnancies climbed higher every year. And that is why, from 1943 onward, Miyuki and Takeshi shifted their focus. They began taking in children, newborns, and toddlers unwanted by their parents, abandoned at the door, or handed over with the hope that one day a better family might adopt them. It wasn't just desperate mothers who came to Kotobuki. War widows, dancers, prostitutes, women with no means to raise a child turned to Miyuki for help. Abortion was heavily restricted by law, so to them, Miyuki seemed like the only option. And Miyuki knew how to make herself known. She placed advertisements in newspapers with headlines like, "Open for adoption," complete with pictures and descriptions of the children as if they were items in a catalog. Prospective parents could even visit, inspect, and choose the child they wanted to take home. Adoption fees ranged anywhere from 300 yen to 10,000 yen, with an additional 1,500 yen tacked on as an advertisement fee. On top of that, mothers who left their children were often charged a support fee, anywhere from 2,000 to 10,000 yen, before they could walk away. On paper, Kotobuki-san'in looked like a well-oiled operation. But in reality, it was a cash machine for the Ishikawas. The donations, the adoption money, what should have gone to food, clothing, and medicine was instead spent on luxuries, land, expensive goods, a lifestyle that seemed far removed from the suffering under their roof. The profits reached close to 1 million yen, a staggering fortune at the time. But none of that wealth showed in the children's care. In fact, the opposite. As the number of abandoned babies grew and the number of adoptions slowed, the Ishikawas cut costs on the children themselves. The infants were fed less than half of what they needed. Just 2 spoonfuls of milk mixed with sugar, watered down, barely enough to keep them alive. They were given water 6 times a day. They were bathed, but left in the same soiled clothes and diapers. When one of them grew sick, no doctor was called, unless the child was already on the brink of death. Babies froze in the winters without blankets or warm clothing. Malnutrition spread like a shadow over the home. For the so-called unsold children, the ones no family came to claim, Kotobuki-san'in became a slow, torturous death sentence. The children were not the only victims. As their numbers grew, so did the burden of caring for them. The midwives hired at Kotobuki-san'in were pushed to exhaustion. They begged Miyuki to hire more staff, to provide more milk, to buy warm clothes for the freezing babies. But Miyuki refused. One assistant midwife, Masako Kishi, had once admired Miyuki and dreamed of learning from her. But after just a year inside the facility, Masako couldn't take it anymore. The endless cries of hungry infants, the neglect, the slow deaths she was forced to witness. It was unbearable, so she fled. unable to stomach the cruelty. And rumors began to spread. Mothers talked about the demon midwife. Some brushed it off as baseless gossip, but others, after seeing how Miyuki and her staff treated women in labor and their children, left the facility immediately, never to return. So how was this even possible? Why didn't anyone step in when death after death kept piling up? The answer lies in the system and in Miyuki's influence. Every death at Kotobuki was recorded, every burial permit filed. On paper, it all looked legitimate. The infants were listed under their biological parents, and the certificates were signed off by a doctor, though he never once examined the bodies. To the authorities, it looked like a string of tragedies in already desperate families. And Miyuki herself wasn't just another midwife. She was powerful, she was respected. She held titles in multiple midwifery associations across Tokyo. To accuse her would be to accuse one of the most trusted women in the city. Without undeniable proof, nobody dared to challenge her. So the cries of starving infants were dismissed as rumors. The whispers of neglect were ignored. And Kotobuki-san'in continued to operate, children dying one by one, hidden in plain sight, protected by reputation and paperwork. But everything changed on January 12, 1948. That night, Tokyo police had ramped up patrols in response to a recent wave of violent crimes. 2 officers from the Waseda police station were staking out the Ennokicho area when they spotted a man on a bicycle, balancing several wooden boxes on the back. He was Ryutaro Nagasaki, a 54-year-old funeral director. When asked what was inside the boxes, Ryutaro calmly explained, infant corpses, 5 of them. He carried burial permits for 3 and was waiting on 2 more. In fact, he admitted Kotobuki-san'in had already requested cremation for 30 bodies, 30 infant deaths, all from a single maternity home. But on paper, everything was legal. Ryutaro was released. But the report reached Waseda Police Station Chief Isamu Ide, and something about it gnawed at him. 30 dead infants in one facility, even if technically permitted, it was alarming. So he ordered an investigation. The next day, autopsies were performed at the National Tokyo Taichi Hospital, and the findings shattered any illusion of innocence. Of the 5 bodies examined, 3 had died of starvation, 2 of exposure, which means they were frozen to death. These babies were not only severely neglected, they were killed. In the early hours of January 15th, heavy knocks echoed through the quiet streets of Shinjuku. When the door opened, police stood waiting. Inside was Miyuki Ishikawa and her husband, Takeshi. Both were arrested on the spot. Alongside those 2, the funeral director, caught carrying the boxes, was also taken in. That same day, investigators stormed Kotobuki-san'in. What they found only deepened the horror. Stashes of food, 8.2 kilograms of powdered milk, 5.6 kilograms of sugar, and 27 liters of rice sat unused, all while the children starved. Records showed 7 infants were still alive, but by the time police arrived, 2 had already died, 1 the night before and 1 just that morning. 2 others were taken back by their mothers, 2 were adopted, and 1 disappeared without trace. As investigators dug deeper, they realized the 5 corpses found that night were only the beginning. Kotobuki-san'in had been quietly funneling bodies to multiple funeral homes. From one mortuary, police uncovered the remains of 40 infants. From another, over 30 more. Each tiny corpse had been disposed of for a fee, 500 yen apiece. It became clear the Ishikawas hadn't been working in the shadows alone. Even some of the very assistants who once came to Kotobuki to learn from Miyuki had taken part in the cover-up. Just 4 days after her arrest, the governor of Tokyo stripped Miyuki of her midwifery license. In court, prosecutors revealed a staggering accusation. Between April 1946 and January 1948, at least 84 infants had died in Kotobuki-san'in. Of those, they believed at least 27 were outright murdered. Starvation, hypothermia, neglect, these alone were horrifying enough. But testimony suggested Miyuki sometimes went even further. When food was scarce, she rationed milk so tightly that babies screamed endlessly in hunger. Those cries pierced her sleep, wore down her nerves, and when her patience finally snapped, she smothered the infants, wrapping them in futons until their cries fell silent forever. The trail of complicity went beyond Kotobuki's walls. Investigators discovered that the couple had enlisted Dr. Shiro Nakayama, who forged around 60 death certificates without performing a single medical examination. The true number of victims was impossible to confirm. By the time authorities intervened, many remains were too decomposed to identify, and others had already been cremated. Some investigators estimated as many as 160 infants might have been lost to Miyuki's scheme. And yet, when the verdict finally came down on October 11, 1948, it shocked the nation. Miyuki Ishikawa was sentenced to just 8 years in prison. Her husband, Takeshi, received 5. Dr. Nakayama got 4. One assistant midwife, Masako Kishi, the young woman who fled in horror, was acquitted. The funeral director, who had only transported the corpses, walked free. But the outrage didn't end there. The Ishikawas appealed, and the Tokyo High Court slashed their sentences even further. 4 years for Miyuki, 2 years for Takeshi. The public erupted. Newspapers raged. People accused the justice system of bowing to money and influence. Hundreds of children had died under Miyuki's care, some starving, some freezing, some smothered, and yet she would serve less time than most petty thieves. Criticism also fell heavily on the government. Rumors about the maternity home had circulated for years. Neighbors reported hearing babies crying endlessly, their wails echoing through the night. But no officials ever investigated. Why? Because, as many later admitted, these weren't children from respectable families. They were the abandoned, the unwanted, the forgotten. And later, Miyuki herself would give a shocking confession. At first, she claimed she had no intention of killing the children. But as Japan's condition worsened, she convinced herself it was pointless to let them live, that helping them meant ending their suffering through death. When asked by reporters whether she felt remorse, Miyuki gave a chilling answer. Not really. I don't mind getting the death penalty if it means I could atone for my sins. But she never faced punishment. On April 28, 1952, the same day the San Francisco Peace Treaty went into effect, Japan declared a general amnesty that nullified countless guilty verdicts. Among them was Miyuki Ishikawa's. She walked free, her sentence erased almost entirely. Years later, in 1969, a Japanese magazine tracked her down for an interview. By then, she was 73. And what did they find? Not a broken, repentant woman, not someone haunted by the cries of children. Instead, Miyuki was thriving, selling soap, creams, even fish. She made a fortune in real estate. After orchestrating one of the worst child massacres in history, the so-called demon midwife lived out her years in freedom. It's still hard for us to comprehend what she did. How could someone like Miyuki Ishikawa, once celebrated as a savior of women and children, become their destroyer? It's true, Japan after the war was a place of unimaginable hardship. Widows, women in poverty, and mothers forced into nightlife jobs were barely able to feed themselves, let alone raise a child. And that's how maternity homes began appearing across Tokyo, over 100 of them supposedly to provide shelter and care. But desperation and poverty don't excuse murder. What Miyuki Ishikawa did was not compassion twisted by circumstance. It was cruelty, pure and simple. Kotobuki-san'in was not a refuge, it was a death house. And what made it even worse, it wasn't alone. On February 10th, 1948, just weeks after Miyuki's arrest, the Asahi Shimbun broke another scandal under the chilling headline, 61 infants dead. Another maternity hospital operating under eerily similar practices was exposed. At least 61 more children had died. Abandoned, neglected, erased. The horror of these revelations forced Japan to act. In April 1949, contraceptives were finally approved. 2 months later, abortion for economic reasons was legalized. It's less a step forward and more a desperate attempt to stop further massacres. Today, the site where Kotobuki-san'in once stood is nothing more than an empty lot. People say that it's haunted, cursed. But what really lingers there are the voices of children who were never comforted, the pain of tiny lives treated like nothing more than trash. We may never know their names, we may never know what they could have become, but they all deserved love and protection. May they rest in peace, and may their story remind us why it's so important to protect the ones who cannot protect themselves. That is all for today. Thanks for watching.